children lost, ensnared by a witch's binding spell. Jessii, the awakened soul, yearns to escape and find a new home. Dare you join her and explore more?
So the first very horrible and creepy fact is that children's toys used to explode all of the time. Parkesine was one of the very first forms of plastic. It was invented during the Victorian era and became incredibly popular. This plastic was molded into combs, collars, children's toys, billiard balls, among other things. The only problem was that this plastic was very combustible and it would literally explode on impact. So children would just be sitting playing with their toys and they would randomly explode. And you can imagine how dangerous this is. Pieces flying in kids' eyes, hitting their bodies. It wasn't good at all. Like, imagine sitting playing with a toy and you have no idea if this is the day it's gonna explode or not. I could not live like that. The next fact is that wallpaper used to poison people. Wallpaper was a big trend in interior decor during the Victorian era, but not just any wallpaper. This wallpaper was called Scheele's green wallpaper. Now, this specific shade of green on the wallpaper was created with arsenic. If you guys watched my Victorian dresses video, I talked about how they used to make the green dresses with this poison. So unfortunately, the deadly chemicals in the dye on these wallpapers would flake off over time, turning into a dust that was easily inhaled. Now, this was particularly dangerous for infants and young children because many of them would get lung diseases or even die by breathing in even the tiniest amounts of this dust. I mean, people would have baby cribs pressed up against this green wallpaper. It was just, how did people not know back then? Next, we have the deadly milk. Yes, you heard that right. Before pasteurization, drinking tainted milk could make a person sick, but not usually kill them outright. So during the Victorian era, this rumor was going around saying that if you put boric acid into your milk, it would purify the milk and keep it longer. So people took this idea in droves and added white powder to milk that their children drank. Now, unfortunately, this poison caused diarrhea, vomiting, and it killed around 500,000 children in England. Take that in for a second. That number is astronomical. All because of this milk. Insane to me. The next fact is that toilets would burst. Indoor plumbing was a new invention during the Victorian period. It was convenient, and running water made indoor sinks, bathtubs, and toilets a popular addition to homes. But the public sewage systems weren't perfected yet. So methane would back up in the sewers and spread to people's homes, where the gas would explode when brought into contact with lit candles. In some cases, the toilets would literally explode. And unfortunately, it would kill the person in the room at the time. Imagine having to go pee and your toilet explodes on you. I mean, between toilets and toys, you just never knew what was gonna happen in your home. Next, we have the poisonous makeup, which I have briefly mentioned in other videos. For some reason, it was important for Victorian women to have very pale complexions back then. This was achieved with the help of face powders and paints, some of which contained lead. The most popular brand of the period, called Laird's Bloom of Youth, contained this chemical. Now, lead is poisonous to us humans, and it impacted women's motor skills. It caused what was called lead palsy on your hands, and if people continued to use this over and over again, it would eventually cause death. death. So literally makeup was destroying people. Then we have an even more disturbing fact. It was called tuberculosis beauty. Now, tuberculosis was a fatal disease back in the Victorian era. It caused these nodules to grow in the lungs, and eventually that would affect your breathing terribly, and then it would lead to death. However, during the Victorian age, women appreciated the beauty that tuberculosis caused. The pale skin, the thin waist, the red lips and cheeks of those infected. So it literally became a trend to try to get tuberculosis so that you would look beautiful. Apparently sick people looked beautiful to women. I don't get it. So yeah, women were purposely going to try to contract this disease to look like this. Then we have what was called the nightshade eye drops. Nightshade is considered to be one of the most poisonous plants in the world. It causes the pupils of the eyes to dilate and become larger. Now, women back in this time thought that dilated pupils were the most attractive, so they would place nightshade drops into their eyes before bed. Super poisonous. And then lastly, we have the deadly baby bottles. Perhaps the most shocking hidden killer of the Victorian age was the newly developed baby's feeding bottle. It was a curved glass bottle to which was attached a piece of rubber tubing that was the perfect incubator for all manner of life-threatening bacteria. Now, the woman who invented this bottle, her name was Miss Beaton. She told mothers while she was selling this product that they did not need to wash the bottle for 3 weeks. So they only had to wash this bottle like once a month. So these bottles became filled with harmful and deadly bacteria that would literally go into the bodies of these children as they were drinking out of it. And this was back when antibiotics were not a thing. So once these kids got sick, like there was nothing you can do. Most of them died. So this was one of the most dangerous baby bottles in the world back in the day. Thank goodness they don't make them like this anymore. And thank goodness like medicine has improved drastically. So we don't need to worry about stuff like this as much. But like between deadly milk, deadly baby bottles, exploding toilets, I don't even, it's so baffling to me, like I keep saying. Alright guys, so without further ado, let's get into this video. Now, the dresses we're going to be talking about are from the Victorian era. I'm sure we can all agree that dresses from the Victorian era were absolutely gorgeous, but not a lot of people know that they were incredibly dangerous. In fact, these dresses were once responsible for thousands of deaths per year. So we're going to be getting into the history about why these Victorian dresses were so deadly, and I'm going to be telling you some specific, very tragic stories about women whose dresses took them to their doom. It's horrible. The first fact that you need to know is that these dresses were very flammable. Victorian dresses were practically designed to be flammable. Most dresses of the day were made of cotton or other open weave fabrics, and some of the petticoats were even made of horsehair. These dresses were often also covered in lace, which burned incredibly easily. So with so many flammable materials on these women's dresses, putting out a dress fire was not a simple or easy process. The dress would become a ball of fire within minutes. And because those dresses were held on with dozens of buttons or laces, there was no way for a woman to get out of them in time. Now, you'd think these dress fires would be a rare thing, right? But it was actually incredibly common, and thousands of women would die every single year. But yet they kept wearing them because that was the fashion. Now, I want to talk about ballerinas for a second because these facts are horrifying. Even for those who didn't wear the enormous dresses were still in danger. Ballerina dresses were made out of highly flammable material as well, and all of these materials that were used made the ballerinas look light and airy. It made them look delicate, and their skirts would stick out in a very traditional style. However, these fabrics were also prone to light up in a heartbeat when exposed to open flames. And you're probably like, well, why would ballerinas be near open flames anyways? Well, back in the early to mid 1800s, they did not have electricity. So when they were performing on stage, the only stage lighting they had were flames on the edge of the stage, very close to the dancers. In 1862, a popular ballerina named Emma Livery was running through a dress rehearsal for an opera when tragedy struck. Her skirt got way too close to one of these flames, and her costume lit ablaze within moments. She was just consumed by flames before anybody was able to put it out. Now, she was given immediate medical care, but she only lived for 8 months after the fire because her burns were so severe and it gave her blood poisoning. happening. But she wasn't the only dancer that had this fate. In 1844, a dancer named Clara Webster met the same end. And then in 1861, 6 dancers died when they tried to help a fellow ballerina who caught fire backstage. It was not uncommon to hear that an entire group of ballerinas burst into flames. I mean, it's horrible facts. The next thing is that a lot of these dresses were actually made out of poison. Victorian dresses were also often dyed with dangerous chemicals and poisons like arsenic. Green was a particularly fashionable color in the Victorian era, and a good way to get that shade was with arsenic dye. So hats, gloves, dresses, any type of clothing were dyed with arsenic if they wanted them to be green. And this chemical also gave women horrible deaths. In 1861, a 19-year-old artificial flower maker named Matilda Scurrer was working with this dye on the daily. And one day she started convulsing and foaming at the mouth, and her skin actually turned this harsh shade of green. It was later discovered that there was a high amount of arsenic in her liver, lungs, and stomach. The level was so high that even her eyes turned green, like the whites of her eyes were pure green. And then the flammability factor of the dress only made things worse, because if the dress even had like the tiniest burn on it, it would release those toxic fumes into the air, which the women would breathe in and then die from the fumes alone. Even if they were able to put the dress fire out, the fumes would still kill them. In 1861, Mary and Emily Wilde, who were the half-sisters of Oscar Wilde, they met a similar fate at a Halloween party. So one of the women were dancing when her dress caught on fire. Her sister saw this and rushed to help her, but the fire spread so quickly and both the sisters perished. Then there was the Archduchess Bathilde of Austria, who also met a fiery end. She was smoking a cigarette and her father was very, very against this, and he walked into the room while she was smoking. So she quickly tried to hide the cigarette behind her back, but her dress obviously caught on fire and went ablaze so quickly. Her whole body went up in flames in an instant, and she was only 18 at the time that she died. There was also just the danger of daily tasks for women wearing these dresses. Many women who died from flammable dresses were simply going about their daily tasks. In 1865, 2 unnamed women in New York reportedly died when they got too close to a hot stove and their clothes went up in flames. Then in 1858, another woman died in Boston after standing too close to a fireplace. This was such a problem, and because there was no electricity in houses, people relied on oil lamps, fireplaces, candles, and they were constantly just surrounded by open flames. So then finally they came out with what was called fire-resistant clothing. The French were among the first to take steps to fight against what was going on. So in 1859 there was a decree that all theater workers must wear flame-resistant clothing. Now it says that this clothing was made out of ammonium phosphates, borax, and boric acid. Now the process of doing this made clothes yellow and extremely thick, like it could barely bend, the fabric was so thick. And because of that, many women and especially ballerinas refused to wear it because it felt uncomfortable, it looked really weird. They would rather risk it than wear this clothing, which is ridiculous. But by the 1890s, skirts had become even slimmer, meaning that women could move around their homes without being at such a constant high risk of catching flame. And then obviously, once electricity was invented, this problem went down even more because people weren't constantly around fire. Now there was one good thing that I found about these old Victorian dresses. The shape of the dress did have a few benefits. One of those being that a crinoline dress reportedly acted as a buoy and saved many women from drowning. So if any women fell into the water wearing these giant Victorian dresses, chances were they survived because it just kept them above the water. So that was the only good thing about them. The first one is glow-in-the-dark hair and makeup. The first half of the 1900s, everything from clocks to lotions to lipsticks to face powder contained something called radium. It was basically this radioactive chemical that would glow in the dark. But of course, they did not know how deadly it was back then. And it was put inside makeup because it would literally make your face look like it was glowing, like you were angelic and beautiful. But there's a sad story about women that worked at a studio painting watches with radium so they would glow in the dark. They were known as radium girls because after some time, almost all of them died from reacting to the chemicals they were using. This was because after their shifts, they would be covered in this glowing substance, but they didn't think anything of it and eventually began loving their dresses glowing in the dark because they would wear them out to parties and everyone would just look at them in awe. Then they started to paint their teeth with radium so they would glow whiter hair, and they would use it in their makeup as well. Eventually they became so sick, they got facial tumors, they had jaw rot, cancer, and then that just led to death. This chemical was just rotting inside the individuals that were using it. Then we have belladonna eye drops. In Renaissance Italy, the flower belladonna was used to make pupils bigger, giving women the look of doe eyes. And this doe eye look was just super attractive at the time for some reason. And the name belladonna is actually translated to beautiful woman as well. Well, people didn't realize that belladonna in all its forms is highly toxic. On the less harmful end, belladonna drops would cause blurred vision, temporary blindness, increased heart rate, and eye irritation. But on the other end, which would be really awful side effects, people could experience mental disturbances, convulsions, permanent blindness, heart damage, and eventual death. The plant shuts down some of the body's necessary life functions, such as sweating, breathing, and heart rate. So it's just not worth it to use these eye drops to look doe-eyed. And I think large pupils look scary on people anyways. Like whenever I go to the eye doctor and get those eye drops, I cannot look at myself in the mirror. I look terrifying. Then we have the corset, which was not really surprising to me that it's on this list because it's literally moving your organs and bones into a specific shape. A corset is an undergarment placed around the torso and chest of the wearer and tightened to enhance the waistline and the bust. They have a long history dating back to the late 14th century and have been worn by women throughout Europe. They've often been thought of as enhancing female beauty regardless of class, though were initially associated with the upper class. Corsets were often laced as tight as possible, leading to an inability to eat or breathe adequately. And they would often rupture internal organs, cause broken ribs, injured spines, and so many women died of corset-related causes like collapsed lungs, internal bleeding, and a lot of the times asphyxia, like they would literally faint because they couldn't breathe. And helping someone who was literally like choking to death from not being able to breathe was difficult because it took so long to take the corset off. So yeah, just be careful out there if you're wearing corsets. I know people still do today. I don't know if it's as tight as they used to, but it can be dangerous. Then we have something called the fontage. A fontage was a headdress that stood tall on the top of the head, pinned to the back using a wire, and with the wearer's hair arranged on the top along with ribbons, lace, and ruffles. The headdress stood several feet high and was used throughout Europe during the late 17th and early 18th centuries. And in order to have this fontage stay upright, women would do everything in their power to stiffen their hair. This included using egg whites, starch, or flour for weeks on end, like without washing their hair, so that it stood up straight so you can put this headpiece on top. Now because of this, a variety of vermin including lice, mites, insects, and mice made themselves at home in some of these women's hair. And some headdresses were so high, they'd easily reach the height of lit chandeliers and catch fire, resulting in severe injuries. And what's so disturbing is that some women at the time suggested flattening a baby's head while they were still growing so that when they were an adult woman, they could wear the headdress properly. That is so disturbing. Then we had things called chopines, or chopins, I'm not really sure how it's pronounced. Chopins were women's shoes created in Venice in the early 1500s. The shoe featured a large platform made of wood or cork meant to protect the foot from irregular roads and muddy streets, in addition to giving the wearer more height. They were often covered in gold or silk and could be measured up to 20 inches in height. And increased height was just like a show of your status. Like the taller you were, I guess the more rich and important you were. So as you can imagine, women were falling a lot, they were breaking their bones, snapping their ankles. It created a lot of injuries. And the thing is, back in that time, a lot of these bone breaks were life-threatening because they did not have x-rays, they did not have the proper medical care, so they would get infections and they would die. And lastly, one that really surprised me is the detachable Edwardian collar. Edwardian collars were high detachable collars worn mostly by men in the 19th century. The detachable collars made it possible to present a new look with the same shirt, saving time and money spent on laundering. Now, men of all classes wore these collars, and a lot of the time it had very stiff plastic on the inside of it to keep it sort of straight up. And the issue is, these collars were worn so tight that a lot of the time the men would choke to death, which I find so strange because if you're struggling, like just take it off. Like I feel like it's not that hard to take off. It's like a button and then it's off. I guess the whole point though is that if they took it off, they wouldn't look as important. Like they just had to keep it on and like bear through it. Because of all the people who died wearing these, they were eventually called the father killer. They could at times cut off circulation to the brain, causing neck swelling and slowly depriving an individual of receiving an adequate oxygen supply to their brain. So they would be at a party or event and they would just lose consciousness, which is terrifying. The very first thing is the electric hairdryer. The hairdryer was first invented by a French stylist in 1890, and this photo I'm showing you now was taken in 1928. Hairdryers used to be very clunky and very dangerous. In fact, they were considered unsafe until the 1950s. So if you put your hair under this, it's up to you. I mean, you're risking it. These things would get very hot, they were very flammable, they would cause fires all the time, so if you put your head in this, good luck. Imagine going to the hairdresser and she's like,
all right, so we're gonna dry your hair. Put your head under this weird contraption.
All right, next we have the facial ice box. This ice mask was used by Hollywood actresses to refresh the face between takes without spoiling the makeup. So right after they were done a scene while they were acting, they would be like, okay, where's my ice mask? I don't know about you guys, but I feel like if I wore this in between takes, it would mess up my makeup because ice is wet and cold and I feel like it just wouldn't work for me. Like imagine wearing mascara with that thing on. No, thank you. All right, next we have the perm machine, and this one is definitely ultra creepy. The first electric permanent wave machine was introduced in London in 1909. This apparatus is called the Gallia, and it curls your hair for better, faster results. Okay, I'm looking at this picture, and it looks like she has a robot jellyfish on top of her head. It looks like this woman is strapped to a medieval torture device. My sister is a hairdresser and I feel like if she saw any of these devices, she would cry. I just feel like looking at these, it must have done so much damage to the hair and they had no idea back then. Permanent waves? More like permanent damage. Next we have the swimming face mask. This is gonna be in my nightmares, guys. This 1920s face mask meant to protect a user's face from the sun. And listen, I don't judge, do whatever you wanna do. But wasn't sunscreen a thing? I mean, maybe it wasn't invented back then at that time, but if someone walked past me with this swimming mask on, I'd be like, excuse me, what's that? What is that? Next we have the dimple machine, and this is just so ridiculous. This bizarre invention by a woman named Isabella Gilbert consisted of a face-fitting spring that pressed two small knobs into the cheeks, intended to create a fine set of dimples. Guys, these were literally metal pieces that would press into your cheeks and cause like scarring. What? And everyone started buying it because they wanted to have these cute dimples. But soon enough, it was actually called out to be a scam. Because obviously metal poking into your face is not gonna give you something that you're supposed to be born with, like dimples. Unfortunately, a lot of these products were just false advertising, but people would just believe it. They fell for it. The next item is the beauty micrometer. Also known as the beauty calibrator, this nightmare-inducing device was created by Max Factor in the early 1930s. Its purpose was to take detailed measurements of a woman's face in order to identify her flaws. So doctors would put these things on women's faces to find her flaws. With this information, she would be able to know exactly where to apply corrective makeup. And I mean, you can't tell me that this doesn't look like a medieval torture device. Right? Imagine going to visit your doctor and before you left, he was like,
actually, before you go, can I stick this thing over your head to find your flaws?
I'd be like, excuse me, sir, you should be fired. All right, next we have the aluminum sleep mask. Okay, this was from 1924 and I don't even know whether I should be laughing or crying. This aluminum face mask was intended to induce sleep by forcing warm breath to the eyes. I mean, there's no way I'd be able to sleep with this thing over my face. I feel claustrophobic just looking at it. Next we have the snowstorm face protector. These conical plastic headpieces were briefly used by Canadian women in 1939 to shield their faces from snowstorms. I'm sorry, but no. Imagine your friend asks you to go for a walk and you're like, all right, I'm coming, Martha. Just gotta put my beak on. Next, we have freezing freckles. In the early 1900s, freckles were thought of as a problem, which is so crazy for me to even read right now because freckles to me are so beautiful. Like, I'm jealous I don't have them. But back in the day, unfortunately, they were thought of as the opposite of beauty, which honestly is ridiculous. Don't even listen to that. So they had procedures to freeze them off with carbon dioxide. Patients' eyes were covered with airtight plugs. Their nostrils were filled in for protection, and they had to breathe through a tube. It's just so crazy because in our day and age now, people wish they had freckles. Like, they're applying freckles with makeup, they're trying to get freckles on their face with henna, people are getting tattoo freckles. Everybody wants them, but back in the day they didn't. It's so crazy how things change. And if you have freckles right now, I'm jealous, you're beautiful. Next we have the heat mask. This terrifying mask from the 1940s could be plugged in to heat the face and head in an attempt to stimulate circulation and make the skin look fresh. Okay, Kermit the Frog. Next we have the sun cape. Before the invention of sunscreen in the mid-1940s, bathers wore garments like this freckle-proof cape to protect themselves from the sun. The cape also features built-in sunglasses. Alright, if I saw this run past me while I was lying in the pool, I would think it was a ghost. And like freckle-proof capes, oh my goodness. And so I guess this just proves to me that sunscreen wasn't invented until after the 1940s, so there you go. And lastly, we have the shower hood. Instead of simply putting their hair up or using a shower cap, people used to put an entire plastic hood over their face while they showered. I mean, why didn't people just not put their hair under the water? Like, I take showers and not wash my hair sometimes. It's not that hard. And if your hair gets like this much damp, you're gonna survive. It's okay. It's just so weird to see what people had way back in the day. The world has changed so much. Okay, the first one is called Killed by a Mouse. Okay. In 1875, a mouse jumped onto a work table in a London factory. A young man stepped forward to seize the rodent, but it ran up his sleeve, up the neck of his shirt, and because his mouth was open, the mouse dashed in. Because he was so surprised, the man swallowed. The mouse began to tear and bite inside the man's throat and chest, and he died soon after. That's like a tragic accident. What baffles me is that the man swallowed. I understand if the mouse just ran in and you had no time to like figure it out, but he like had the mouse in his mouth and he's like, gulp.
Well, maybe it was like instinct
to swallow it?
Yeah, because maybe he was like choking on it, so maybe it was just physical instinct to swallow it.
Can you imagine what people around, because he's in like his work,
and how quickly that would have like escalated is what I'm saying. Like, that's just like a tragic accident.
I could not even imagine having something in me that I could not control what it's doing. I'd be like slapping my chest.
Did the mouse survive?
Probably not.
That's what I want to know.
Probably not.
There were no survivors.
Or he just ran out after, like, just doing my daily business. I mean, I'm not rooting for the mouse, but you never know.
No, you never know.
This next one is called Killed by Eating Her Own Hair.
Sounds like an old wives' tale.
A 30-year-old woman died, and doctors were baffled when they investigated the cause. They discovered a solid lump of human hair weighing 2 pounds in her stomach. When they spoke to her sister about it, she told them that during the last 12 years, she had been in the habit of eating her own hair. Why did the sister not like tell somebody about that? Like, she waited until she died.
Also, 2 pounds of hair in your stomach? 2 pounds?
She's a hairdresser, so like
just 2 pounds? I feel how light hair is. Like, is this real?
This is real. These are all real.
This is facts?
These are all death certificates that are real.
That's insane. But I guess in those days, like, they had like long hair.
And like over 12 years, right?
12 years.
That's a build-up.
You know, I'm not even surprised because, like, have you ever watched My Strange Addiction? People do weird
There
things.
probably is an episode for that. Next. Killed as a zombie. A funeral for a man was in full swing when the lid of the coffin opened and the corpse began to climb out. Everyone screamed and ran away to lock their doors. The corpse went around knocking at every house until he was eventually caught and thrown into a marsh where he died again. So obviously these people thought he was a zombie, but this poor man wasn't actually dead because they made those accidents a lot back then. He came out and he's running to the doors, like probably like, help me, and they're like, throw him into the marsh, he's a zombie.
He was probably better off to wait until they put him in the grave because, you know, back then they had little bells where like if somebody wasn't actually
They
dead,
would, like,
they
ring
could ring
it.
the bell. Because that was something that happened a lot. Because they weren't as like medically advanced.
But that's still risky. Because what if they all like walked away, they went home, they're like, oh, he was a good man. And then he's like ringing the bell in the middle of the night and they can't hear him.
I just feel like back in those days, people were really like
Superstitious.
very, very much so.
So they're like, that's a zombie. He came back
Easily
alive.
spooked. That is also tragic.
That's a nightmare.
These are all tragic.
I know.
What about his own family? Was his own family like
They
thrown in the
ran.
marsh?
They ran.
His whole family's like, no, it's done.
They locked their doors. They're like, he died.
We're already
done.
renovating his room. Get rid of him.
Okay, this next one is called Torn to Pieces by Cats.
Ooh.
In 1870, there was this rich woman that wanted to breed and buy as many cats as she possibly could. She had hundreds. One day, disaster struck and a fire broke out in her house. The cats were trapped behind a door and 2 maids were sent to free them. Because they were so scared and riled up, the instant the door was open, they flew at the young women, tearing, scratching, and biting them until they died from their injuries.
I believe it. I believe it.
There's like such thing as having too many things, and especially when it comes to living creatures, because then it becomes like a zoo scenario, right? Like they're all trapped in a house. There's too many. They can't live properly. So I feel bad for these cats, and I'm rooting for them. I'm sorry. I'm rooting for them.
I think in any scenario where an animal is trapped and
They're
is
scared.
facing death, they have no choice.
Yeah.
They will do whatever they need to do.
Especially like the cats aren't gonna know that the fire was an accident. They might think that this woman like put them in the room and just like it's getting really hot all of a
They
sudden.
didn't know that the fire was an accident.
They don't understand. This next one is called Laughed Himself to Death. In 1893, a man was joking with his friends when he was seized by fits of uncontrollable laughter, and he couldn't stop. He laughed for nearly an hour, and then he began hiccuping. 2 hours later, he died from exhaustion. I've heard of this happening,
It's just
actually.
like unlocked a fear. That gives me like Joker vibes.
Yeah.
You've seen like the new Joker where he like
Yeah.
has fits of laughing. It's like you can't control it, it just happens. Like a hiccup.
I had hiccups all day 2 days ago, and they wouldn't stop.
What are hiccups? Make it make sense. Why do we hiccup?
Isn't it like a muscle spasm?
What is it for? Like sneezing is obnoxious, but you know why you sneeze. Like your body is like trying to get rid of something, and like coughing, same thing, but like hiccups or like when somebody tickles you, I straight up like you laugh, but like I feel like that's like a torture method.
Yeah. Like you don't think it's funny, but you're laughing because it's like a reaction.
Yeah, and it's like you're like you need it to stop. Like you need it to stop. No one's like tickle me, tickle me. You know what I mean? Like if someone's tickling you, it's like
Yeah.
an attack.
It's only fun for one person, and it's the one
And
doing
like
the tickling.
and if it goes on for a long time and you're laughing so much, it's like painful.
It's a little psychotic, the person doing the tickling and not stopping. You gotta have issues because you know what it feels like.
I will literally scream. Like if Luca tries to tickle me, I'm like, stop, stop! Like in between laughter, I'm like screaming.
Yeah.
And then he stops.
This next one is called Dancing to Her Death. In 1879, the family of a woman named Marion thought she died, so they gave her a funeral, and as they were gathered around her coffin, she suddenly sat up and said hello to everyone, and then said, "I'm not dead yet, but I will die soon." She then climbed out and began dancing and singing around the room. Her family watched her in disbelief, and then she died that evening.
I think that's beautiful. She was like, I'm not done yet. I have a bit of energy. What I'm gonna do with that energy is dance around the room and surprise everyone.
Okay, but they thought she was dead. Like
She was-
they weren't waiting.
She wanted to have one last surprise, one last show. Listen, I'm a theater person. I can respect somebody.
One more time!
Yeah,
Encore!
like, yeah, like one final show. I mean, it sounds like something like a Tim Burton movie. You can't like picture that being like a Tim Burton
I
movie.
can picture
Just, like,
that,
somebody
but-
dancing around the room to like creepy piano music, and then going back in the coffin and
Yeah,
just
but this wasn't a movie. Like, this really happened. Like, I feel like that would be really scary. That's terrifying. Especially if she looked sickly and, like, not well. They thought she was dead. She must have looked awful.
I think I would have wanted to like witness that.
If it was me, and you thought I died, and I got up, and I was like, and
you did it.
and I'm, like, going around, and then I collapse, wouldn't you be like, why was that necessary? I don't know. If I come back as a ghost, I'm just gonna dance around your house.
Please do. I would love that. It's you. You're not scary.
I would never scare you.
That wouldn't scare me. Would you be upset if I died and then you heard me like singing something in like the other room? Or
It would upset me, but I wouldn't be like scared of you. But I
Yeah.
would be like super sad. I'd be like, oh my gosh,
But
she's
wouldn't you
singing.
be like happy for me?
No, I'd be sad, Mandy. No matter what, I would be sad. There's no happiness that would come from that.
Oh. So then I won't. So then I won't.
No,
do
if you
that.
can, do it.
Okay.
Why are we talking about this?
This is what the
so
tangents
sad.
become.
This is
Yeah,
so
but you're like,
sad.
if you can do it, but then why would I want to make you feel upset?
I'd rather have some of you than none of you.
Oh.
Why are we gonna cry right now? That's so sad.
I don't know. That was a cool story.
Oh, the last one is the man who swallowed a billiard ball.
That would get stuck.
It did.
It did. That would get stuck. It did.
It did. In 1893, a man was enjoying a night out with his friends when he made a bet with them that he could put a billiard ball in his mouth and close his lips around it. Well, he did, and immediately began to choke. I just imagine his lips going all the way around, and then, oh, what did you expect? Hold on, it's not done yet.
Seriously. And like all of his friends around him, like
They're all like waiting. And his lips go around.
like what a stupid idea. What a bad idea. And also I want to know, had he done it previously? Has it been successful in the past? Or is this the first time?
Definitely not. So this is what happened next. So he immediately began to choke. As if that wasn't expected. Like, what else is gonna happen?
Immediately.
There was like no pause. He was just like,
Was it worth it?
okay. So he immediately began to choke. Why can't we get through this? When we have a podcast, we're just gonna be laughing the whole time.
And then what happened?
Okay, after that, I'm not gonna say it again. His friends tried to remove the ball, even holding him upside down and slapping him on the back, but nothing worked and then he died.
That's horrible.
I couldn't even imagine the panic in that moment that man went through. He was also really
I feel like
stupid.
holding somebody upside down is not gonna do anything. Like if it were you, not only would I be banging on your chest, but I'd be banging on your chest too. Did I say chest twice?
I would... Maybe I would be reaching into your mouth.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
like, no matter what.
Like, literally?
I don't even care how much it hurts. My hand would be down there.
Yeah, yeah.
No questions asked. You know when someone's dying in lifeguarding course, you have to ask them if you can help them?
Yes,
That's
it's
so stupid.
yeah, you have to ask for consent.
If you have a small wound, I get that. But if you have a billiard ball in your mouth, I wouldn't be like, excuse me, can I help you?
That's interesting that you said that because I totally forgot about that.
Yeah.
If someone is literally choking, you have to ask for consent.
Legally, you have to be like, can I help you?
And like in that moment, how are you even like corresponding?
And if they don't say anything, you okay, sorry about that. I'll go away.
So that's the end?
Yeah, so that's it. So I hope you enjoyed our crazy video. So there were all kinds of different Victorian hairstyles back then. They usually comprised of women putting their hair up off of their faces. You rarely saw their hair just down when they were out in public. But there was something creepy that they would do with the hairpins they put in their hair. Hair jewelry was extremely popular back in the Victorian era. Like they would literally wear other people's hair on a clip. Now, I mean, that's not so bad because if you really think about it, even nowadays in the modern times, people wear real hair extensions. That's kind of similar, right? The stranger part is that sometimes when a family member passed away, they would take a part of that family member's hair, braid it, and put it into their hair clip so they can wear it on their head always. Now, I'm not one to judge what you do after a family member has passed because obviously that's a very personal thing. I just don't know how I feel about it personally. And there's so many kind of eerie pictures if you go on Google and look at all of the real hairpins that have been found over time. Some have been sold at garage sales, thrift stores, museums. They've been found in old abandoned houses. So if you don't know who the hair belongs to, it's a little bit eerie. The next thing they had back in the day were mourning dolls. Now, children having dolls is not a weird thing. I mean, children have owned dolls for hundreds and hundreds of years. Think about all the doll advertising even today. But in the Victorian era, there was another use for dolls. Because of the fact that medicine was way less advanced, more people got sick and more people died younger in life, especially children who don't have a very great immune system. So when a very rich family lost a child, it was customary for them to have what's called a mourning doll. This doll would have to look exactly like the child they had lost. They would often be made of wax, and and sometimes the hair would be taken straight from the child and put onto the doll to add an extra level of authenticity. Once these dolls were made, they would usually be placed in a crib inside of the house, and every single day they had to be cared for. Their clothes had to be changed. They had to have food placed in front of them as if they could actually eat it. They had to be treated like a real life child. And this supposedly helped the family cope with their loss. What's so weird is that there's actually a TV series coming out like in real life very soon called Servant, and that show is just like what happened back in the Victorian era. I'm pretty sure the two main characters lose a child, so they get a doll to look like their child that they actually take care of. It looks like a really interesting yet creepy show. I'm not sponsored by them, but I might watch it. Next, we have professional mourners. So like I said before, the mortality rate of people was really high because medicine was not advanced. So there were funerals all the time, unfortunately. So when someone passed away and they didn't have enough people attending their funeral, they would hire professional mourners, so AKA actors, to act like they're crying and sad to fill up the rest of the funeral home. So it's kind of like hiring extras to come stand in the background and fill space. I find that very strange, but apparently it's been a custom for hundreds of years. I don't really know if they do that anymore. I've never seen professional mourners. They could have been around and they're just really, really good actors. I don't know. I just find it strange that that was actually a career you can choose. Like, imagine being in class and the teacher's like, so Jessii, what do you want to be when you grow up? Definitely a professional mourner. I'm really good at crying. I cry all the time actually at home, you don't even know. But like I said, I'm not judging. Everyone handles someone passing away differently, and that's just a personal choice. I'm just talking about our history here. So since we're on the subject of funerals, I realize this video is really dark, like darker than I intended. I'm so sorry. Mourning in the Victoria era was a very big deal. They even had manuals to give out to people who lost a loved one that would instruct you on how long you were supposed to mourn. Imagine having a booklet like that nowadays. Like, you definitely cannot leave your house for 3 years. Like, it tells you exactly what you can and can't do while you're trying to recover from this loss. The manual would say it was very important that people saw that you're in mourning for the entire period of time. This involved wearing all black, and depending on who the family member was, you would have to retreat from society until the period was over. So you basically have to completely isolate yourself during that time. For example, if an upper class woman's husband passed away, she would have to be in all black and mourning for up to 4 years. By the way, if anyone doesn't know what mourning means, it means a time that you're grieving the death of somebody. Some women even are expected to wear the color black for the rest of their lives. And in addition to all of these crazy strict rules, women are not allowed to attend any social events for an entire year, no matter what. So I'm really glad those rules don't apply anymore. At least I don't think so. Maybe in some places around the world, I hope not. The next thing that was a bit strange that they did back in the Victorian era was they predicted their future spouse using a mirror. Back during this time, people were very superstitious, and one of those things was about mirrors. One of them was that if a young lady looked into a mirror on Halloween night, she would see the man she was gonna marry. And when you hear that nowadays in modern times, it sounds really silly, but these women took this extremely seriously. So on Halloween night, they would go to their mirror and be like, please, please, show me my future Prince Charming. Some women claimed it actually worked, and they did see their future husband. Also, Halloween is known to be the night when the barrier between the living and the dead is the weakest. So people would use this to their advantage, maybe see loved ones that have passed away, or seen the ghostly image of their future husband. So, interesting. Another thing they did with mirrors is they covered them. Any mirror in their house, they would completely just put a blanket over it. Throughout history, mirrors were constantly being attached to stories about spirits coming through the glass, or showing the person who looked into it a secret truth about themselves. Basically, if someone passed away in their home, they would have to go around the entire house and cover all the mirrors. The reason they did this is because there was this superstition that they could walk by a mirror and see the ghost of their loved one in the mirror reflection. And if that happened, the thought was that the spirit would be forever trapped inside the mirror and never be able to find peace. This is obviously not a common practice anymore, but it was taken very seriously back then. And the last bizarre thing we're going to talk about are cemetery picnics. With fewer parks, gardens, and museums to choose from, many people in the Victorian era thought they could have a good time in graveyards. So there weren't enough parks to seat everybody, apparently, and there was a ton of space in all of the graveyards. There were beautiful grass, trees, flowers. So people just thought, hey, if I can't get a seat at the park, I'll go sit in the cemetery. I mean, I feel like I would low-key love to do that because I'm just strange. The local cemetery was the closest thing they had to a park, and groups would pack lunches and have picnics among the tombstones. Cemeteries became such heavily trafficked destinations that guidebooks were distributed to visitors at some of the most famous locations, like Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn or Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge. They literally had travel booklets that had all the cemeteries, and it said like, have lunch here, beautiful location. So yeah, my question to you, would you ever have a picnic in a cemetery? I feel like I might, I don't know, is that even respectful? Alright guys, so let's get right into today's video. So people in the late 19th century and early 20th century had this morbid obsession with death. And so they were therefore fascinated with the idea of communicating with those that have passed on. And this could be attributed to the high death rates and low life expectancy from back then, forcing people to come to terms with death a lot earlier on. In today's time, people are living a lot longer. We have better health care. People get cured when they're sick, but back then people got sick all the time and died all the time. And with this fascination with spirits, there was a lot of con artists that came about to profit off of it. They came up with tricks to convince people they were actually communicating with the dead when they weren't. So I wanted to go over some of those tricks with you guys today. The first one is called spirit rapping. Spirit rapping is the phenomenon of ghostly communication through knocks on walls or furniture. So one could ask if a spirit was present in the room, and they would ask that spirit for a knock to confirm they were there. Sometimes the spirit could even recite the alphabet by matching the knock to a letter to spell out words and sentences. Now, the biggest con artists out there when it came to spirit rapping were three sisters, and they were called the Fox Sisters. Their names were Kate, Maggie, and Leah. They would perform their seances in a room of their house in New York, where they had set up a system of apples tied to strings to make thumping sounds on the floor, ceiling, and walls, and eventually they graduated to the manipulation of their own joints to make cracking and popping noises. That is just like so creepy to me, and they were extremely successful doing this for a long period of time. People would pay them so much money, and these girls would literally have fake knocking happening throughout the house whenever they asked the spirit a question, but it was all fake. Eventually though, their ruse did fall apart. The sisters started to argue with each other in front of their clients because Maggie started to express hate for what they were doing. She started to feel guilty, didn't want to do it anymore, but her other two sisters wanted to keep going. So one day Maggie was so frustrated with them that in front of an entire group of people that they were performing to, she revealed all of their tapping and knocking tricks, like in front of all these people watching. And so obviously word got out about this and they weren't able to do this anymore. And I mean, that's just karma. If you're lying and conning people, it's gonna come back to bite you. I'm actually pretty glad that Maggie pulled the plug on that one. Okay, the next thing is items that people put into a locked box. And these con artist mediums told people they could describe what they put in the box. Each participant of the seance was instructed to bring a small personal object with them, which they placed in a concealed box that was locked. And like I said, the medium would then reveal what they put into each box, like down to the last detail, and people were just so flabbergasted by this. Like imagine bringing a personal item from home that nobody else has seen, nobody else knows, and someone's just able to guess what it is. So you're probably wondering, how did this con artist medium do it? So the audience believed they were watching the box the entire time. But while the lights were off, the assistant switched the original boxes containing the items with an exact replica of the box. And so that assistant was able to take their boxes backstage, look at what the items were, and there was this wireless radio in the medium's ear, and they were able to communicate what all those details were. So it was pretty sneaky behavior. Then we have something called spirit trumpets. Spirit trumpets were long cones that would mysteriously float about the room and amplify the voice of spirits during a seance. This mysterious instrument was usually used in tandem with the manifestation cabinet, so once the medium was inside the cabinet, they had access to a tube that was connected to the trumpet. So they could like stand there and whisper into the tube, and it would just sound like these awful disembodied voices that were going through the crowd, so people were terrified. The trumpet would move around via a system of cords and wires operated by assistants backstage. So because it was so dark in the room, because these con artist mediums always had the lights go out, obviously, the people wouldn't see this trumpet floating around, so it would literally sound like ghosts were all around you. And obviously the lights being off also adds to the creepy ambiance. Then we have the levitating tables. Imagine a casual Friday night seance when suddenly the table begins to levitate. And this would both scare the participants out of their pants and would just make them believers in the paranormal. Con artist mediums had a plethora of tricks for making tables move and float during a seance. Some were as simple as using a kitchen knife in your sleeve to slip into a particularly lightweight table's drawer to lift it, although this was a pretty dangerous thing to do because you're in the dark and you have a knife and you're trying to lift a table. More advanced grifters built tools just for lifting tables during seances, including wrist cuffs with hooks concealed under the sleeves. And like I keep saying, because these tricks took place in the dark, it was just so simple for them. They could whip out these tools, no one would see them, and they could just lift the tables. And it would just convince all these people that paranormal activity was actually happening. And then lastly, we have the ectoplasm. This one is like the weirdest one to me. Ectoplasm described any of the many substances that would materialize from the orifices of a medium during a seance while they were channeling a spirit. Con artists would fake the appearance of ectoplasm, often telling the audience member it would kill the medium if any of them attempted to touch the substance. That and the fact that these seances once again were being performed in complete darkness, it just made it easy for this con artist medium to fake what was happening, because in the dark you saw this stuff coming out of their mouth and their nose, and it looked real because of how dim the lighting was. Each medium had their own special blend of tools that they called ectoplasm, but most commonly it was just a dish rag, cotton, or muslin. It's funny because when I was doing research and looking at all these photos, it clearly looks like a napkin to me or like some sort of cloth, but the people in the moment in the dark thought it was legit. Martha Baraud was the most famous medium using ectoplasm of the day. She would often incorporate faces into her gauzy ectoplasm cut from newspapers, and she was exposed as a fraud when seance attendees spotted celebrities and politicians they had seen in the morning paper. So yeah, the thing is, a lot of these people were eventually found out and known as frauds, so they couldn't keep it up forever, which makes sense.
In an enchanted realm, an oddity stirs, beckoning the curious. Meet Jessii, once ensnared, now awakened, waiting to be yours.